right here, let's sit down, right here, don't go, no way, yeah, I like that, bring that, right here, let's sit down, right there, don't go, nowhere, little baby gon' shake that, 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 yeah, I like that, bring that, right here, let's sit down, right there, don't.
Yo, what up, YouTube? We back with another reaction video. Reacting to, what is this? Nirara, I don't know how to say that. Nirara fight stories? Hey, don't judge me. The fake record fraud who lied his way to the UFC. I think I heard about this guy. Let's get into it though.
Ukrainian MMA fighter Acegodmanagement made his UFC debut. On the surface, this seemed like a completely unremarkable story, with dozens of fighters from around the world making their UFC debut every year. But none of them have a backstory quite as ridiculous as Acegodmanagement, a man who was willing to do whatever it took to reach the highest level of MMA, despite being a fighter lacking anywhere close to the skill required to fight in the UFC. Unable to make the UFC based on talent alone, Acegodmanagement instead resorted to insane levels of fraud, which included legally changing his name to get a new record, claiming previous losses were other fighters and not him, creating fake fight posters, impersonating promoters, submitting fake fight footage, and inventing fake MMA promotions, all to stat pad imaginary wins. This was all done with the aim of creating an MMA record good enough to fool the UFC into signing him and fulfilling his dream. Majarov's story may have taken him to the UFC octagon, but the road to get there was as wild as you will ever see, and exposed how far being willing to lie can take you, especially in MMA. This video tells the story of how Acegodmanagement went from certified bum to certified UFC fighter, through lies and deception so brazen, it barely seems believable that it could have fooled the UFC. Before we jump into the video, a quick channel announcement. From now on, this channel will only have MMA and The story of Acegodmanagement begins in Odessa, Ukraine, but it didn't begin with the name Acegodmanagement. Askar was actually born as Artur Shadakov, and Shadakov took a liking to martial arts from an early age with dreams of making it to the top of the sport. Shadakov's MMA career began in the Ukrainian regional scene in 2013, but it would not be a successful start, with the 19-year-old losing via first-round submission in his debut after just 39 seconds. While not ideal, it's not exactly the end of the world for a fighter to lose in their debut. Plenty of successful fighters have lost their debuts, including Andrei Arlovsky, whose disastrous debut was covered in my last video on the story of Vyacheslav Datsik. And losing his debut didn't stop Arlovsky from achieving greatness in MMA and becoming a UFC champion. Shadakov waited a year before taking another fight, looking to improve his game and begin forging his path to UFC glory. Unfortunately, despite the extra time spent training, he wound up losing his second fight as well, and again by first round submission against an extremely low level local opponent. Losing your first two fights is pretty bad, but perhaps Shadakov just got unlucky and was caught with fluke submissions, or perhaps he was struggling with nerves. Given that we know this story ends in a UFC octagon, his next fight was surely going to be third time lucky. But it wasn't. Shadakov lost his third straight fight, again by submission and again in the very first round. That's not to say that he made no progress, as lasting 90 seconds before succumbing to a choke was a new record for his longest ever fight. This third loss looks even worse when you see that the fighter that he lost to retired with a record of 1 win and 3 losses, meaning Shadakov was the only win he ever got in his career. After trying his hand at making his way to the UFC based on skill and realizing that wasn't going to happen, Shadakov opted for the tried and true method of fighting absolute bums to get easy wins and stat pad his record. After starting out 0-3, Shadakov put together a remarkable 3-fight win.
What? He got a submission off? How? Like how? Decision? Bruv. You're trash. Like, bro, you that swollen, you ain't got a knockout or something, bro, TKO or something? You ain't catch nobody with nothing? 2 rounds? How you get a unanimous decision in 2 rounds?
win streak to bring his record back to even, but the competition he got these wins against is truly, and I mean truly, pathetic, even for the extremely low standards of combat sports. The 3 fighters that Shadakov managed to beat have a combined career total of 0 wins. And I don't mean they had 0 wins combined before fighting Shadakov, I mean all 3 have never won a single fight in MMA to this day. Not only that, but all of his opponents were making their debut, with 2 of them never fighting again after losing to Shadakov. Ustam Slobodian did get back into the ring for one more fight after losing to Shadakov, but he lost again and decided to call it a career at 0 wins and 2 losses. Truly horrendous competition that was clearly cherry-picked to try and pad Shadakov's record back to respectability. These fights were at such a low level that there are discrepancies over how many times he actually fought, with Tapology recording him as beating the same guy twice in the space of 3 days, whereas Sherdog has him fighting Safarim Nasirov only once. Regardless of which service you choose to believe, he had successfully gotten his record back to respectability at either 4 wins and 3 losses or 3 wins and 3 losses. With his confidence boosted after beating up the local dentist and bin man, Shadakov's next fight was a step up in competition because his opponent had actually beaten somebody before. Alexei Ivanov, while not a great fighter, was definitely a decent regional opponent and on a win streak. Shadakov had clearly decided that he was ready to step up in competition, and he was immediately sat back down, losing by a first round knockout to leave his record at 3 wins and 4 losses and confirm once and for all that he just wasn't very good at mixed martial arts. Undeterred, Shadakov went back to fighting taxi drivers and got a win over yet another unknown Ukrainian fighter making his debut. But his career was beginning to follow a very predictable pattern, as whenever he stepped up in competition, he was soundly beaten, and usually in the first round. Most of these fights have absolutely no video that I can find, but given that he usually lost by submission, we can deduce that Shadakov's lack of ground game was his kryptonite, and it would plague him for his entire career. Eventually, Shadakov's record stood at 7 wins and 8 losses. Put yourself in the shoes of Arthur Shadakov. You had plans of making MMA your career and getting to the UFC to test yourself at the elite level. And instead, you've lost all of your fights against legitimate competition in the first round and only ever managed to beat cherry-picked opponents. At this point, would you give up on your UFC dream and accept that fighting is never going to be more than a hobby for you? Or would you keep at it, go harder than ever in training, and try and make an improbable career turnaround through sheer determination and hard work? Well, whatever you answered, Arthur Shadakov decided to do neither, and instead, he conspired to try and climb his way to the UFC by lying, committing fraud, and carefully manipulating his record and reputation to hide the fact that he was not a good fighter. And the crazy part is, it actually worked.
You a finesse.
Given what we know about Shadakov's lack of MMA skill, it seems ridiculous to know that this guy would somehow end up in the UFC years later. And for this to happen, it required truly ridiculous levels of deception. Fight record-keeping databases Sherdog and Tapology do a meticulous job of tracking the results of professional fight cards from around the entire world, no matter how small and insignificant the promotion might be. It's actually quite impressive at the breadth of their coverage, which has results for fights between absolute nobodies in obscure promotions in nations as far apart as Ecuador, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan. Sherdog had tracked all of Shadakov's fights, including his wins over the cherry-picked opponents, and there was no escaping his record. Arthur Shadakov had an MMA record of 7 wins and 8 losses, and the only way to change that was to start winning fights. This bad record would sink any chances he had of earning a contract with a high-level MMA promotion and earning some decent money. So to make his way to the UFC, Shadakov and the team around him embarked on a brazen campaign of fraud with the aim of manipulating his record to the point a major promotion such as the UFC would take a chance on him and offer him a contract, thinking they were signing a promising up-and-coming budget Conor McGregor. Shadakov's initial attempt to shake off the stink of his 7-win and 8-loss fight record was a simple yet cunning trick. He decided to try and just change his name and start fighting under a new identity with a blank record. Artur Shadakov would eventually opt for a full rebrand and legally changed his name to Askar Mazharov, a name he would stick with for the rest of his career. However, this name change was spotted, and his appalling record followed him to his new name, meaning if he wanted to improve his record, he'd either need to dramatically improve at fighting, or dramatically improve at tricking record keepers. Mazharov, as he was now known, opted for the fraud approach and went all in. He and his team got together and decided that their best way forward was to begin disputing the results of his fights that he had lost with the likes of Sherdog and Tapology to get his record changed. The first target was his loss to Marcelo Tenorio in 2016. Marcelo Tenorio was an unknown Brazilian fighter who in his fourth ever fight beat Mazharov in the first round by submission at an event called Full Metal Dojo 11, a very low-level fight card held in a nightclub in Bangkok, Thailand. Mazharov clearly felt that this event was low-level enough that nobody would notice or be able to verify that he was the one who had lost if he decided to dispute the result. So he engaged in an amateurish attempt to get record keepers to change the result by emailing them posing as the Full Metal Dojo promoter, claiming the fight Mazharov had supposedly lost had never even taken place and should be removed from the record books. However, Mazharov made some amateur mistakes, the first of which was using a .ru Russian email address, an odd choice when pretending to be the promoter of a Thai MMA promotion. Their case also wasn't helped by the Sherdog Fight Finder team being easily able to prove the promoter name Mazharov had signed off the email with was fake. And the cherry on top was the fact that literal fight footage of Mazharov getting submitted by Tenorio existed, which was a little bit awkward, with the video evidence ruining any chance Mazharov had of getting rid of his loss to Tenorio. His team shifted their focus and targeted another loss to lie about. This loss came against Fan Rong in China after just 79 seconds via rear naked choke in a promotion called the Legend King Championship. The fight had taken place in December 2016, but years later, with Mazharov desperate to clean up his record, Sherdog's Fight Finder team received a suspicious email, again from a .ru Russian domain email address, claiming that Mazharov had not fought on the card, and instead, a man named Hassan Atagayev had been the loser. After their embarrassing attempt last time, Mazharov and his team came better prepared, with a fake fight poster and even a YouTube short of a random fight between an Asian man and a white guy, claiming this was footage of the fight and it clearly wasn't Mazharov because his distinctive tattoos were missing. But while they'd put more effort into the fake job this time, it was picked apart by Sherdog even more brutally than the first. I mean, where do we even start with this one? There's the obviously fake fight poster that looks like it was made by a kid in paint. There's the fact they used the wrong promotion logo for Legend King Championship.
Like I made this damn fight like this is horrible.
On the poster. There's also the issue of the Sherdog team obtaining the actual event poster, which clearly showed Mazharov was scheduled to fight. And for the cherry on top, there was again footage of the fight showing Mazharov getting his ass kicked in glorious 720p. These were the most infamous examples of Mazharov's attempted fraud, but they were far from his only attempts.
If you sleep on your side, I bet you hate your pillow, and this is why. They might be as fluffy as a cloud.
Elbow ass, shorter ass. What?
Mazharov didn't only attempt to get losses taken off his record, he also had wins that were ruled fake by the Sherdog team and not added to his record, such as an unofficial custom rules bout that Mazharov drew but initially got added to his professional record as a win before it was overturned. Given Mazharov's lowly status in the MMA scene, these attempts at lying were not well known at all, and Mazharov is far from the only fighter to have tried to get fake wins on his record or tried to have legitimate losses removed, and nobody looked too deep into it. But for every obviously fake win or failed attempt at getting a loss removed, there were plenty of attempts that were successful and snuck by record keepers who don't have hours to devote to disproving the claims of a completely unknown Ukrainian fighter. That was why it came as such a shock to the few who had heard of Mazharov when it was announced in 2021 that he had somehow inked a deal to join the UFC, and with a touted record of 25 wins and 7 losses. How had a fighter who'd once had a record of 7 wins and 8 losses managed to convince the world's biggest MMA promotion that he was a promising enough prospect to be worthy of fighting on the biggest stage in combat sports? And how had his fight record managed to shift from dreadful to fantastic so dramatically?
20-6 is just insane when I know you got 9 losses game. Like, could at least kept the
To
9 losses.
99% of people who noticed the UFC had signed Askar Mazharov, they wouldn't have given it a second thought. With no real reputation to speak of, and a purported 25-7 record, he seemed no different than any of the other talented fighters from around the world that the UFC signs to a 12k fight, 12k win contract to pad out the bottom of fight cards. But for the record-keeping teams who dealt with Mazharov and his fraud before, it must have felt like a punch to the stomach that such a prolific fraud had managed to con his way into the UFC. But while Mazharov may have felt like he'd won the war by cheating his way into the UFC, the war was far from over. The UFC tried to schedule Mazharov twice for fights in 2021 shortly after signing him. However, his scheduled bout with Ben Rothwell fell through due to visa issues stemming from COVID-related travel restrictions. His next scheduled UFC debut against Dustin Jacoby also fell through, with Mazharov pulling out with an undisclosed injury. At this stage, there was still barely anything known about Mazharov, and barely anybody seemed to care about him enough to dig into his history or his fight record. But that would change as his UFC debut finally came to fruition, with a fight against respected contender Alonzo Menifield in the light heavyweight division being scheduled. But with the fight now looking like it was definitely going to happen, there was increased scrutiny and research into Mazharov as journalists, gamblers, and hardcore fight fans began to dig into the background of the unknown Ukrainian, eager to learn more about him. Unfortunately for Mazharov, the record keepers at Sherdog and other similar sites were also doing digging, and it wasn't long before they struck gold. In the week leading up to the fight, it was revealed that 2 of Mazharov's purported 25 wins had come in a completely fictional promotion named Mung Mung Championship. These fake fights had managed to slip by record keepers by virtue of Mung Mung Championship having the same initials as the very real Mars Marshall Championship. Googling Mung Mung Championship today will bring up essentially no relevant website or photos. MMA Core, a fight database, still has Mung Mung listed as hosting one event, at which the only fight of the night was Mazharov beating a guy with a career record of 1 win and 7 losses. But even this website had Mazharov's record as having 10 losses, more than the 7 losses that the UFC had been fooled into believing. It wasn't long before another fake win was exposed, when it was revealed that an alleged Mazharov win had been held at a venue in Ukraine that had been permanently closed months prior to Mazharov apparently emerging victorious. These fake wins had managed to escape detection by Sherdog and Tapology by virtue of nobody caring about Mazharov. But with the bright lights of the UFC shining on him, his record was melting away, and the build-up to his debut had turned into a complete farce, with Fight Week build-up being dominated by the scandal. Once some fraud had been detected and the story of the fake UFC fighter began to pick up steam, it was open season on Mazharov's record, with everyone digging for the next fake result to expose. Sherdog uncovered a previously unknown Mazharov loss hidden away on a Chinese video site that had been wrongly attributed to another fighter, with Mazharov caught in 4K, or 480p in this case, tapping to a guillotine choke. Between the time Mazharov had signed with the UFC to the time that he actually walked to the octagon, his record went from 25 wins and 7 losses to 19 wins and 12 losses, meaning the results of 11 fights had been changed. A complete embarrassment for Mazharov and for the UFC. Exposed as a liar and as a fraud, it was time for Mazharov to face the media. But luckily for him, it was COVID, and media access was fairly limited, meaning the journalist to ask him questions was the king of the softball, John Morgan. But in fairness to John, he did eventually ask what everyone was dying to hear an explanation for.
Talking about bouncing around, can we ask about your record? It's been in the news this week that your wins and losses have changed and your record. Do you have any comment on all that situation and kind of what you've seen play out?
Mazharov replied to the question regarding his record being picked apart by blaming it on the fact that a lot of his fights had taken place in China, and the Chinese organizers were not diligent in getting fights added to record-keeping sites such as Sherdog, which completely doesn't answer how he had fake wins on his record, or why there was multiple proven cases of him trying to get losses removed from his record. His next excuse was to blame the changes on an admin at Tapology wanting to prove themselves. Again, this excuse makes no sense, as it's not like Tapology and Sherdog's claims of fraud were false. So even if there was an overeager admin, does it matter if the admin's findings are all true? Majarov's final excuse was to claim that the losses on his record that he tried to get rid of were supposed to have been semi-pro fights, and they shouldn't have counted on his record. And the accusations that he changed his name to dodge losses was untrue, as the only reason he changed both his first and last name were because he got a new stepdad. Again, given we know he submitted fake fight posters, fake fight videos, and impersonated promoters, this excuse, it's just more nonsense. At this point, the guy was so deep into the lie that it was too late to backtrack and come clean, especially at UFC Fight Week, just days before fulfilling a lifelong dream of making his UFC debut. So while it must have been embarrassing to be questioned and ridiculed like this, he continued onwards, ready for the fight with Alonzo Menifield on the weekend. Menifield, for his part, was not impressed with Majarov's record antics, and said the situation was both preposterous and madness, and questioned whether Majarov was a real fighter or just a poser. But the time for talking was done. Despite becoming a laughingstock, Majarov was a UFC fighter, and he did make the walk to the octagon, albeit with an amended record of 19 wins and 12 losses. Yes, his record had been exposed as fake, but if he could beat a respectable fighter like Alonzo Menifield, then the fake record debacle would become irrelevant, and he'd have proven that he belonged on the UFC stage after all. His legacy in MMA would be dictated by this one shot at glory, a true make or break situation. All of the humiliating losses and struggles over the years could be vanquished by a single punch. When the lights were the brightest, no amount of fake record padding or lying could help Majarov escape the fact that he was just not good enough for the UFC.
Trash, bro.
Majarov was taken down twice in the first round and pummeled with elbows into the UFC. His debut ended in the first round and he landed just 2. Majarov was taken down twice in the first round and pummeled with elbows into the UFC. His debut ended in the first round and he landed just 2 significant strikes. But at least he wasn't submitted. Small victories, I guess. Given that the UFC pays new fighters extremely little, you have to question, was it even worth it? But I guess if fighting in the UFC was a dream for Majarov, then he would probably say it was. In the aftermath of the fight, Alonzo Menifield would admit that the fact Majarov had faked his way to the UFC made him want to hurt him even more, calling Majarov a weirdo and a chump, while saying he wanted to fight him in the parking lot. Majarov's debut week had been a complete and utter disaster from start to finish, but there was a glimmer of hope in the fact that his contract was not a one-fight deal, and he would maybe get a shot at redemption down the line. And by maybe, I mean he would have no shot at redemption, as unsurprisingly, the UFC...
Wouldn't that be a void of contract? Because the contract was based off of you being a 25-6 or 7 fighter. Like, we wouldn't have gave you extra fights or even tried to reschedule your fights after they both got canceled if you wasn't a 25-6 fighter. You being a tomato can does not help the promotion.
Cut him less than 2 weeks after the loss to Menifield. So to recap Majarov's time as a UFC fighter, first of all, his years-long record of fraud was exposed at length, his reputation was destroyed, he got dominated and lost in the first round, and then shortly after he got fired. Surely it cannot get any worse than that. Well, it did get worse, because 2 months after the fight, it emerged that Majarov had failed his drugs test and was banned by the Nevada Athletic Commission for 6 months. This truly may go down as the most humiliating UFC debut of all time. His UFC fight took place back in June 2022, and it is now December 2023. So what has Majarov been up to in the time since his UFC debut went up in smoke? Well, one development is that even more fights on Majarov's record had to be amended. He walked to the octagon touting a 19-win and 12-loss record, but that record now stands at 15 wins and 14 losses on Sherdog. Tapology are slightly more generous and credit him with 2 extra wins, putting his record at 17 wins and 14 losses, meaning 2 more wins were removed and 2 more losses added in the time since his UFC debut. In terms of his fighting career post-UFC, there is nothing to speak of. He hasn't fought since getting battered by Menifield, and it doesn't seem like there has been any real attempt to make a fight. And perhaps after ticking UFC debut off his bucket list, he's decided to move on to bigger and better things. The Mazharov story is a bizarre one that highlights the opaque nature of MMA outside of the UFC and exposes some of the shenanigans that go on at the lower levels of the sport, where less eyes are on fighters. Mazharov is far from the only fighter to have tried to stat pad his record with fake fights. However, I don't think anyone has been close to as successful as him in going all the way to the UFC in the modern era on the back of a multitude of fake wins and unreported losses. The moral of the story? Crime doesn't pay. But in MMA, it might pay, in the form of a 12K show and 12K win contract that gets terminated after you embarrass yourself. The end.
So that was the end of the video. Hold on, let me see how he say his name.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then check out my video on MMA's biggest psychopath, Vyacheslav Datsik. For videos on football and American football, check out my other channels linked in the description below. Drop a like if you enjoyed the video.
So you're not gonna tell your name. Alright, boom. This is a good video though. I finally got the whole backstory of the fake record, man. I don't understand what the purpose of doing the fake record was. Once you got beat up, not even beat up, once you got submitted back to back, wouldn't you be like, damn, either I need to learn submission defense or I need to get out of this sport? Like, there's no way. I'm not about to just keep getting choked. That's crazy. Like, what are you doing? And then you still didn't work on it. Like, as soon as you got to the UFC, you got put on your ass. Like, what are you doing? Like, I'm trying to see what's the psychology behind him saying, yeah, I want to get to the UFC. That's my dream. Okay, I'm going to set up goals. Like, let me train. I seen him training. Now, you could fake training videos. You could just, oh, yeah, I threw a little kick. Oh, throw some water on me. I was sweating. I've been in the gym for 3 hours. Like, you could do that. I don't see the purpose in it. I knew he was on steroids. Well, that's an assumption. Let me say that's an assumption because he didn't tell me if he was on steroids or not, but he did fail a drug test, and he went from small to light heavyweight out of nowhere. So, yeah, I think he roid raging. Or whatever bodybuilder drug they be doing, train, whatever. He's on something. There's no way he's not on something. Like, he was small. How the hell did you? Wait, bro, he turned into Brawley. Like, there's no way. But yeah, you basically lied on your resume to get 12 bands. Why would you not just make your resume better by not getting your ass whooped? I don't understand. Like, what was you training for? Nothing? Or maybe training cost too much, so he was like, fraud is better. I don't know. But that's the end of the video. Make sure y'all like, comment, and subscribe, and share the video. I'll see y'all in the next one. Stay safe, y'all.
Can't stop me, ain't to live is to come. All this pain got me feeling accomplished. See this man turn me into a monster. Hey, I'm in God mode, can't stop. I'm to live is to come. All this pain got me feeling accomplished. See this game turn me into a monster. I'm in God mode, can't stop, can't stop. Hey, all that pain got me feeling jaded. Many to roll when to make it. Still plugged into the mix, but lagging out before the update. Drop back in different times, same location.